The wake was held in a small chapel with worn pews and the smell of wilted flowers. People were there out of obligation or blood ties, but not out of memory. Most of them spoke in whispers, polite smiles, formal hugs, prepared speeches. No one seemed to remember the war. They didn't even mention the deceased's past. Just father, friend, good neighbor. It was into this cold, ceremonial setting that he entered. An 86-year-old man. A war veteran, though no one there knew it. He wore an old suit, worn by time, and shoes that had seen much road work. In his hand was something small, wrapped in a faded cloth. An object he carried as if it were a fragment of a soul, the last thing left of a brother in arms. But no one noticed. No one looked at him with respect or sincere curiosity. Only whispers. Who could this gentleman be? Did he come in by mistake? He didn't answer. He just walked to the last pew in the chapel and sat down. There, alone, immersed in the silence of a memory that no one else seemed to have. Have you ever felt out of place in a place where you should have been welcomed? Have you ever felt like the world has forgotten something you hold sacred? That veteran didn't want applause or tributes. He just wanted to fulfill a promise. A mission as serious as any order received on the battlefield. But around him, everything seemed so banal. Even the deceased's children seemed far from the truth. They spoke of their father as if they had only known a part of him, the civilian, calm, unscarred part. And meanwhile, at the back of the room, a man with a soul scarred by war held in his hands living proof that the hero who lay there had left much more than memories. He had left a legacy. Stay with me, because what you are about to see is not just a story about war. It is about oblivion, about silence, about the pain of being ignored when all you carry is truth, courage, and memory. This story has a weight that goes beyond the beautiful words of a ceremony, and it all started with that simple gesture. An old man, an empty bench, and a package that hid a secret capable of transforming that entire wake. But nobody knew that yet. Yet. In the front row, a lady was dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was crying for what she understood, a recent loss, a beloved relative. But in the last row, the veteran was not crying. His suffering was older, deeper. It was the weight of memories that no one there carried. Of sleepless nights, of promises made with life hanging by a thread, of silences imposed by decades of oblivion. He stared at the casket without blinking. Every word spoken at the altar seemed to hurt him, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. They spoke of the deceased as a good father, a good man, someone who made the best breakfast in the neighborhood. But no one knew about the day he carried a bleeding man from behind, under fire. No one knew about the muffled screams on the radio, the sand in their eyes, the fear that shaped those men forever. The veteran clutched the small package tightly between his dry fingers. It wasn't just a medal. He was the only witness to a sacrifice. The only proof that that man, now inside a polished wooden coffin, was much more than what they said. And there, isolated, he thought, how is it possible for someone to live so long and still be forgotten? Maybe you've already witnessed something similar. Or maybe you felt it firsthand, being in a place where no one knows your pain, where your value is invisible, where your silence carries more history than any speech. If this touched you in any way, I invite you to leave a comment below to tell us what this story brought to your mind. Because when we share what we feel, we give voice to what the world so often silences. And if you believe, like me, that stories like this cannot disappear over time, leave your like. It may seem like a small gesture, but it helps this message reach more people, more hearts that may also be carrying something in silence. And if you want to continue walking with us through these forgotten memories, through these stories of truth, pain, courage, and legacy, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't let memories die. Here, each forgotten story breathes again. The ceremony continued. Time seemed to slow down for him, but there was something building in the air, a subtle tension, as if something was about to happen, and no one knew about it yet. The voice of the person speaking up front seemed distant. It was as if the words were hitting the walls of the chapel and returning empty, meaningless, like echoes of an incomplete truth. The old veteran did not hear what they were saying, or perhaps he did not want to hear. His body was there, but his mind had already passed through the years. And from the bench where he sat, immersed in his own silence, he clearly saw something that no one else seemed to see. The absence of truth. His eyes, blurred by time but still intense, stared fixedly at the coffin. It wasn't just pain. It was revolt. It was a kind of sadness that you don't cry with tears, but with the weight of what you carry inside. The memory of that desert still burned as if it were yesterday. The smell of blood, the suffocating heat, the sound of explosions tearing through the sky. It all came back in detail. A scenario where life was summed up in decisions made in seconds, and where the line between living or dying could fit into a look, a gesture, a promise. It was there, in 1968, in the middle of nowhere, that he heard a phrase from his friend that stuck like a hot iron in his soul. "You're not going to die today, understand? We still have an agreement." He could barely breathe, bleeding from his abdomen, his vision blurred, his consciousness wavering. But those words kept him alive. He couldn't leave. He couldn't fail. Their mission didn't end there. They were dragged 3 kilometers on the ground, amidst gunshots and mines, with his friend saying, "Just a little more," while he himself trembled, exhausted, holding back his screams so as not to call death. When they reached the shelter, they both fell, but he survived. And since then, he has carried within himself not only gratitude, but the responsibility to honor that gesture. A promise made in the middle of war is not broken in times of peace. And now, more than 50 years later, there he was, old, tired, alone, watching the world treat this hero as if he were just another body to be buried. A good neighbor, a present father, an ordinary retiree. But not the soldier, not the brother. No one there knew about the medal he carried in his pocket. No one knew what it meant, or the mission behind that little piece of metal. He felt his heart tighten, not for him, but for everything that was about to be forgotten. Because what hurt the most was not the time that passed. It was seeing that time did not teach us anything. That even after everything, people still judge by appearance. They still measure value by what is visible, by what is told, and not by what was experienced. On that bench, with his back aching, his eyes burning and his throat tight with pent-up emotion, he felt the presence of the past more strongly than ever. He remembered the farewell, the muffled screams, the sand getting through the cracks in his clothes, the feeling of helplessness as he watched his friend fall for the last time. He promised he would take that medal, that he would tell the story, that he would not let his friend's name be erased. But no one seemed interested. None of his children would look him in the eye. None of his relatives would come near him. He was just an old stranger, perhaps weak-minded, perhaps with too much time on his hands. And that hurt. It hurt like a second war, the war of indifference. How many stories are lost like this? How many legacies are erased without a chance to defend themselves? Maybe that's why these stories need to be told. Because the world needs to remember that behind every silence, there is a hidden truth waiting to be revealed. Write in the comments. I remember those the world forgot. Well, it's a simple phrase, but it has enormous power. Because sometimes all a story needs to live on is someone willing to remember. There was something stuck in that veteran's chest, something that still needed to be said, something that still didn't have space in the words of those who were leading the ceremony. He knew he couldn't leave there without fulfilling, without delivering, without breaking the silence that crushed him inside. And without realizing it, his hands began to move towards his jacket pocket. The eldest son's voice trembled as he read from the paper in his hand, filled with rehearsed memories. He talked about afternoons in the backyard, family picnics, advice on how to be a good father and husband. People nodded, some even gave wistful smiles. But at the back of the room, the veteran stood motionless, his face hard and his eyes moist, as if every word spoken was a cruel reminder of everything that was being ignored. It was a beautiful speech, but empty, a portrait without depth, because the man who lies there was not just a good neighbor or a storyteller for his grandchildren. He was a fighter, a soldier who saw the worst side of humanity and still came back with his heart intact. A man who, faced with chaos, made impossible choices to save those by his side. And yet, in front of his own family, he was reduced to light and safe memories. Not a word about the battlefield. Not a mention of the nights he cried in secret so as not to appear weak. Not a memory of the horrors he faced in silence, without ever seeking applause. The old man clutched the cloth with the medal tightly. His trembling, wrinkled, time-marked fingers seemed to want to shout what he couldn't say. Not because he lacked courage, but because he knew that no one in that room was prepared to hear the truth. Beside him, a woman with strong perfume and a distant look whispered to her friend, "I think he got lost. It must be an old man from the neighborhood." He heard, he felt, but he didn't react. He just took a deep breath. Because when you survive a war, you learn to ignore what doesn't deserve a response. The greatest pain doesn't come from gunshots or bombs. It comes from forgetting. How many people there knew that he couldn't sleep for months because of the screams he could still hear even in the silence? How many knew that he himself almost didn't come back? That it was the man in that coffin who saved him when no one else could? How many knew about the medal hidden in his pocket? A medal he kept for decades, waiting for the right moment to give it away, as promised. The truth is that the wake was like a poorly staged play. Everything there was appearance, ritual, formality. There was no depth. There was no essence. Those people were burying a man they didn't know completely, and that tore him apart inside. He felt like an intruder in a show that should have been written with the right words. An extra in a movie where he knew the original script, but it had been rewritten without his permission. And that's where the impact of this story comes in, because it reveals something bigger than just a poorly told goodbye. It shows the fragility of memory, how easily entire legacies are erased or molded to fit what is most comfortable. And worse, the difficulty many people have in seeing beyond the surface. There is a stark difference between remembering and actually knowing. The veteran knew this. I was there as a living witness to what no one had the courage to tell, and every minute in that room made the wound open a little more. Meanwhile, the ceremony continued. Speeches came and went. And with each one, his grief grew. It wasn't just longing. It was a kind of double mourning. He was burying a brother, and with it, the truth about that man. No one there knew the weight he carried. The nights he woke up screaming his friend's name. The birthdays he spent alone, looking at the medal and wondering if he would ever be able to give it away. And now that he was finally there, in front of his family, no one recognized him. It was as if he had crossed half a century for nothing. As if the promise had aged along with him, and the world around him had forgotten not only the pact, but everything it represented. And yet, he didn't get up. He didn't interrupt. He didn't complain. Because he learned that sometimes the hardest thing is not surviving the war, but continuing to exist in a world that forgets what the war taught you. Write in the comments, "I value the memory of those who fought." Sometimes, a simple phrase like this can rekindle a flame that has been extinguished over time. He looked down at the faded cloth in his hands. He gripped it tighter. Then, with a slow movement, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The moment he had been avoiding for years had arrived. But there was no way to put it off any longer. There was still time to tell the truth, even if it was for the last time. When the last of the speeches ended with a murmured amen and hesitant applause, a general movement began to take over the room. The first steps towards the exit were almost imperceptible, but the veteran felt them like an open wound being stitched up in a hurry, without care. They were ready to bury this man, but not the truth he carried. The old man's eyes fixed on the coffin for a few more seconds. Every wrinkle on his face seemed to tell a story that no one else there knew. He had been there since the beginning of the ceremony, motionless as a war landmark, but now something inside him was pushing him hard. It wasn't impulse, it was destiny. His body hesitated as he stood up. His legs were shaking, his knees were cracking, his spine seemed to resist, but the decision had already been made. He wouldn't leave carrying that thing with him again. The sound of shoes on the wooden floor, low conversations, and discreet cries filled the chapel. But to him, everything seemed silent. The world around him dissolved as he took the first step, then the second, one after the other, as if he were marching again, only this time towards what might be his last mission. And every meter walked was a silent struggle against time, against physical pain, against the oblivion that threatened to erase everything. When he passed the second bench, a woman touched her husband's shoulder and whispered, "It's that man who was alone back there." The man just nodded. They still didn't know who he was, or what he was about to do. The cloth in his pocket was heavy, not because of the fabric, but because of the promise it held. Every stitch of that faded stitching held memories he could never tell. There were things war takes from you, and others it forces you to carry. And he had been carrying that for more than 50 years. The silent mission of a soldier who was still fighting, now against oblivion. He stopped a few steps away from the coffin. He took a deep breath. The ceremony, theoretically, was already over. Some people stopped, intrigued by his approach. Others moved away a little, perhaps fearing an outburst from an unknown old man. No one knew that they were facing a historic moment. No one imagined that what was about to be said would change everything. The veteran's eyes were filled with tears, not because of age, but because of the repressed anger, the accumulated pain, the injustice of seeing the truth being buried in silence. He reached into his jacket's inside pocket, with the same firmness he used to pull a wounded comrade out of the mud. And then, carefully, he removed the cloth bundle. Some whispered, others simply froze. The medal, now visible, reflected soft light from the side window. It was small, marked by years, but it carried within it a symbol that no one there could immediately understand. It was more than an item of war. It was a testimony, an untold behind-the-scenes look at the life of the man they were about to bury. He looked straight ahead, then to the sides. The whole room seemed in suspense. And then, in a hoarse, worn, but incredibly firm voice, he said, "This man saved my life. 3 times. And he made a promise. If I came back before him, I would give this to his family, because what he did cannot be forgotten. It cannot be erased." The silence that followed was absolute. There were no more footsteps toward the exit. There were no more formal smiles or discreet crying. There were only wide eyes, half-open mouths, and a collective emotion that built in the air like a thunderclap about to fall. One of the deceased sons, the same one who had given a speech a short while earlier, staggered up to the old man. His eyes were red, his face pale. When he saw the medal, he fell to his knees. His hands were shaking. He stammered an apology, as if he realized too late the value of what he had lost. The veteran didn't cry. He just placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and said calmly, "Some wars continue, even after the last bullet is fired. And the hardest is to be forgotten by those who should remember." That sentence went through the room like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just heard, it was felt. It touched a place that ordinary words can't reach, because it was real. It was raw. It was the hidden truth of a journey most would rather not see. Comment here. Honor is not forgotten. Because sometimes a single sentence has the power to keep alive what so many have already let die. And if you thought that was strong, there's more. Because what happened after that moment? No one was prepared to witness it. The boy, still kneeling before him, was trembling like a child. The words he had heard seemed to have disarmed something inside him, as if the entire structure that supported the image of his own father had crumbled before the aged medal in that man's hand. The pain he felt now was not for the recent loss, but for what he never knew, for the time wasted in not asking, in not listening, in not wanting to know. And the veteran saw it with deep eyes, without judgment, only with the expression of someone who knew all too well the weight of opportunities that never come again. Around them, the room was still silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. There was a different density in the air now, something that was somewhere between shame, respect, and revelation. Some people were crying silently, while others seemed to be simply paralyzed. A younger man, leaning against the wall, was wiping his eyes openly. It was the chaplain, and at that moment, he seemed more like an apprentice than a spiritual leader. The metal gleamed softly in the veteran's wrinkled hands, but the shine didn't come from the metal. It came from the truth it held. A raw fragment of a journey that had been lived away from the cameras, away from the public record, away even from family. A hidden truth, buried not out of carelessness, but out of fear, out of shame, out of a culture that has always swept the horrors of war under the rug of convenience. The veteran looked at the deceased sons. There was no anger on his face. There was compassion, because he knew, more than anyone else there, that living with what one has let happen is sometimes more painful than any battlefield injury. He handed the medal to his eldest son with a simple, almost solemn gesture. And in that movement, he handed over not only the medal itself, but the entire legacy that came with it. The entire mentality of a generation that learned to survive without fanfare, without expecting recognition, just doing what was right, even if no one would ever know. And it was there, at that moment, that the ceremony took on another meaning. It was no longer a formal farewell. Now was a moment of revelation, of repair. A turning point where the backstory of a man's life finally came to light. And with them, the weight of decisions that marked not only his trajectory, but that of everyone around him. The son held the medal with both hands and began to cry as if he had lost his father for the second time. Only now, he was aware of who he really was. A silent hero. A man who had hidden his wounds and achievements to protect others from the pain of knowing. The old man watched everything in silence. He wasn't looking for applause or thanks. That wasn't what it was about. This was just the fulfillment of a promise. And anyone who has been part of a true brotherhood knows, promises don't have an expiration date. They last decades. They survive death. The commotion was spreading. The camera on one of the cell phones, which had been discreet until then, was now broadcasting live. Unintentionally, that intimate moment became public. And like many truths that are ignored until the last second, when they finally appear, they explode like a scream that has been stifled for too long. People who had previously thought about leaving returned to their seats. The atmosphere was different now. The ceremonial lightness had been replaced by a sense of responsibility. There was no way to continue the wake in the same way. Something had changed. There had been a real impact. A transformation in the way everyone there looked at that coffin and at themselves, because somehow everyone was faced with their own failures. Failures to listen. Failures to connect. Failures of courage to ask about what really matters before it's too late. The old man sat down again, but now he was no longer alone. People came closer. They sat next to him. They touched his shoulder. They asked his name. And each gesture was one less wound, a discreet patch in the fabric of a story that had almost been forgotten. Write in the comments, I care about what was left silent. Because in the end, it is these phrases, small but sincere, that keep alive the stories that time tries to erase. And as symbolic as that moment was, what happened next was something no one there could have ever imagined. A turnaround that gave new meaning to everything, including the way the entire country came to see that man. That night came earlier than usual. The city lights seemed more distant, quieter, as if the whole world was trying to make sense of what had just happened. While videos circulated on the internet, shared by emotional strangers, the veteran rode home in the back seat of an old car, driven by one of the organizers of the ceremony. he had refused any kind of official ride. He didn't want a military driver. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted to get home. During the journey, the driver looked in the rearview mirror with restless eyes, as if he felt he was transporting a living legend, but without knowing how to react. The veteran didn't say a word. He just kept his eyes fixed on the road, as if each meter of asphalt was a relief, a distance between him and the emotional weight he had just carried. Arriving at the small wooden house in the suburbs, he thanked them with a slight nod. No speech, no explanation. Just the same posture he had carried for decades, firm, silent, and resolute. He entered, closed the door, and sat in the same place he sat every morning, facing the window. It was the only spot in the house that still received direct sunlight in the evening. There he took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, he felt that something inside him was at peace. Meanwhile, outside, the world was waking up. Social media was exploding with comments. The video of the wake, with its brutal simplicity and cutting message, went viral on all platforms. It was as if thousands of people suddenly realized that they had ignored something essential for too long: the value of memory. Printed newspapers began with headlines such as, "Hero revealed in moving farewell," "The truth that a wake brought to light," "Who is the man who made the country cry?" Television programs sought answers. People from the city passed by the chapel just to see the place where everything happened. And there, where before there was a cold and anonymous room, now flowers were piling up. Handwritten letters, folded flags, lit candles. The chapel, once simple, became an improvised memorial, a pilgrimage site. But curiously, the veteran was not there. He declined invitations for interviews, public tributes, and emotional speeches. He did not despise gestures. He just did not need them, because his mission was not to be recognized. It was just to honor a promise. And that he had already done. In his modest home, the landline phone rang non-stop. Military associations, journalists, veterans' representatives. Everyone wanted to talk to him, but he didn't answer. Not out of arrogance, but because he understood something few had yet understood. That the real impact lies not in those who shout the loudest, but in those who act truthfully, even when no one is looking. The deceased's family was now experiencing a kind of reverse mourning. They were crying not only for the loss, but for what they had never known in life. The eldest son decided he wanted to know more. He visited the veteran's home a few days later, with a notebook in his hands and a question in his eyes. "Can you tell me about my father?" The old man just pointed to the chair next to him, and for the first time in decades, he opened his mouth to narrate, not with forced emotion, not with words chosen to move, but with the raw and clean truth of someone who lived through it. There, in that cramped room, a new journey began, to reconstruct the memory of a man through the eyes of another. A mission that the veteran did not expect to have, but which he accepted without hesitation. The impact of the video continued to grow. Distant cities sent messages. Children drew pictures. Young soldiers, touched by the story, wrote to say they were inspired by that silent courage. And even public officials, accustomed to empty rhetoric, apologized for their omission. But he did not respond to any of them. Not out of disdain, but because true glory for him was always invisible. It was knowing that, because of that simple gesture, something in the world had changed. That thousands of people now saw a little beyond the surface. That maybe the next time an old man walked quietly into a wake, someone would stand up and ask who he was. Comment here, "I see what no one sees." Because sometimes that alone is an act of resistance. And what happened after this wave of commotion was something that not even he could have foreseen. A sequence of events that would transform not only his friend's legacy, but his own place in history. The letter arrived on a cloudy morning, along with the newspaper and the usual silence. It was a thick envelope, stamped with an official seal, and sent by a high-ranking official. He took his time opening it. He left it on the table while he put the kettle on, as he did every day. Routine was his refuge. formalities never were. When he finally broke the seal, the contents did not surprise him. A brand new, shiny medal, accompanied by words carefully written by an aide, for bravery, loyalty, and the example that moved the country. There was also an invitation to a ceremony, a grand hall, a speech of thanks, tributes, press. He read it all carefully. Then he placed the medal on top of the old one, the one wrapped in cloth, stained by sand and time, and took a deep breath. This wasn't about him. It never was. It wasn't about the shine, or the eyes that now looked at him with respect. It was about keeping a promise. It was about a friend. It was about not letting the memory be dragged into oblivion, as he himself had so often been. The war had taught him that true honors were rarely accompanied by applause. They came in the silence of those who carry the weight of decisions that change everything, in the invisible transformation that happens when someone chooses to do the right thing, even if no one sees it. In the mindset of those who understand that glory is not a stage, it is a legacy. He responded to the letter with few words. He thanked her politely, but declined the ceremony. I have done my part, and I did it for him, and for all those who have been forgotten. This was not a gesture of modesty. It was loyalty. It was loyalty carried to the end, as if it were the last mission left. The following days were different. Not because of the change in routine, which remained simple, punctual, and unhurried, but because of the way people looked at him. The postman, who had previously simply delivered the mail in a hurry, now stopped and asked, "Was that really you in that video?" A child from the next street, who always ran through the gardens, approached one afternoon with a drawing in his hands, the coffin, the medal, and an elderly man with kind eyes. The transformation was not in the external world. It was in the way the world began to connect with stories like his. Silent stories that almost no one hears until it is too late. Stories that, behind their simplicity, hold truths that time tries to hide. And he knew that even though that moment had passed, the impact would remain. Because now, when he walked through the streets, people greeted him with respect. But what moved him most were the subtle gestures. Someone holding the door, a nod, a long look as if recognizing more than age. Recognize the path. One day, sitting in his usual spot, the old veteran saw through the window a group of young men in uniform passing by. Recruits from the local base, probably on their way to some training. He watched them with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew what awaited them. He knew of the invisible scars, of the battles that were fought long after the war was over. But he also knew that they were not alone. That there was finally a space in the world to acknowledge what had previously been ignored. And at that moment, he understood that the mission he thought was over had in fact generated another. Something bigger. A silent change that was beginning to spread. In the mentality of families, in the decisions of each person, in the small choices of those who began to see others with more humanity. Comment here. Silence also has a voice. Because sometimes what we need most isn't more noise, it's more listening. I'm glad you've made it this far, because something in this story really touched you. Maybe it was the silence filled with meaning, or the weight of a promise that spanned decades. Either way, it's good to know that there are people who still listen to this kind of story with an open heart. If this content made sense to you, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I carry that memory too." And just so I know that you stayed until the end and walked with me through every detail of this journey, take advantage and like the video. Not because it helps the channel, but because it helps these stories to continue existing. Stories that often just need a space to breathe again. And if you want to keep hearing stories that the world has almost forgotten, subscribe to the channel. There's always more coming. With the same truth, with the same soul, and with this commitment to giving voice to what no one else is telling. There's a video here that complements all of this. Click and continue with me there. I think it will make even more sense after what you just saw.